Olaf Tryggvason. Olaf Tryggvason 969 September 1000 was King of Norway from 995 to 1000. He was the son of Tryggvi Olafsson, King of Viken Vingulmark and Rånrike, and, according to later sagas, the great-grandson of Harald Fairhair, first King of Norway. He is numbered as Olaf I. Olaf is seen as an important factor in the conversion of the Norse to Christianity. Many of these new converts were converted under threat of violence. He is said to have built the first Christian church in Norway in 995 and to have founded the city of Trondheim in 997. A statue of Olaf Tryggvason is located in the city's central plaza. Historical information on Olaf is sparse. He is mentioned in some contemporary English sources and some skaldic poems. The oldest narrative source mentioning him briefly is Adam of Bremen's Gesta Hammaburgensis ecclesiae pontificum of circa 1070. In the 1190s, two Latin versions of Olaf's saga Tryggvasonar were written in Iceland by Ottar Snorrason and by Gunnlaugur Leifsson. These are now lost, but are thought to form the basis of later Norse versions. Snorri Sturluson gives an extensive account of Olaf in the Heimskringla saga of circa 1230, using Ottar Snorrason's saga as his primary source. Modern historians do not assume that these late sources are accurate, and their credibility is debated. The most detailed account is named Olaf's saga Tryggvasonar and Mesta Greatest Saga of Olafur Tryggvason, and is recorded in the Flata Jarbok, and in the early 15th century Bergsbok. Biography. The account in this article is primarily based on the late sagas. Birth and early life. There is uncertainty of both the date and the place of Olaf's birth. The earliest Norwegian written source, the Historia Norwegiae of the late 12th century, states that Olaf was born in the Orkney Islands after his mother fled there to escape the killers of Olaf's father. Another late 12th century source, Agrip af Norgskanunga Sagum, states that Olaf's mother fled to Orkney with Olaf when he was 3 years old for the same reason. All the sagas agree that Olaf eventually came to Kievan Rus, specifically the court of Vladimir the Great of Kiev. The version in Heimskringla is the most elaborate, but also the latest, and introduces elements to the story that are not found in earlier sources. It states that Olaf was born shortly after the murder of his father in 963, while other sources suggest a date between 964 and 969. The later dates cast doubt over Olaf's claim to be of Harald Fairhair's kin and the legitimacy of his claim to the throne. Snorri Sturluson claims in Olaf Tryggson's saga that Olaf was born on an islet in Efjærlandsvatnet, where his mother Astrid Eiriksdottir, daughter of Eirik Beadaskal, was hiding from her husband's killers, led by Harald Greycloak, the son of Eirik Bloodaxe. Greycloak and his brothers had seized the throne from Håkon the Good. Astrid fled to her father's home in Uppland, then went on to Sweden where she thought she and Olaf would be safe. Harald sent emissaries to the King of Sweden and asked for permission to take the boy back to Norway, where he would be raised by Greycloak's mother Gunhild. The Swedish king gave them men to help them claim the young boy, but to no avail. After a short scuffle, Astrid with her son fled again. This time their destination was Gardarike, Kiev, where Astrid's brother Sigurd was in the service of Vladimir the Great. Olaf was 3 years old when they set sail on a merchant ship for Novgorod. The journey was not successful. In the Baltic Sea they were captured by Estonian Vikings, and the people aboard were either killed or taken as slaves. Olaf became the possession of a man named Clerkin, together with his foster father Thorolf and his son Thorgils. Clerkin considered Thorolf too old to be useful as a slave and killed him, and then sold the two boys to a man named Clark for a ram. Olaf was then sold to a man called Rias for a fine cloak. 6 years later, Sigurd Eiriksson traveled to Estonia to collect taxes for King Vladimir. He saw a boy who did not appear to be a native. He asked the boy about his family, and the boy told him he was Olaf, son of Tryggvi Olafsson and Astrid Eiriksdottir. Sigurd then went to Ries and bought Olaf and Thorgils out from slavery, and took the boys with him to Novgorod to live under the protection of Vladimir. Still according to Heimskringla, one day in the Novgorod marketplace Olaf encountered Clerken, his enslaver and the murderer of his foster father. Olaf killed Clerken with an axe blow to the head. A mob followed the young boy as he fled to his protector, Queen Aloja, with the intent of killing him for his misdeed. Only after Aloja had paid blood money for Olaf did the mob calm down. As Olaf grew older, Vladimir made him chief over his men-at-arms, but after a couple years the king became wary of Olaf and his popularity with his soldiers. Fearing he might be a threat to the safety of his reign, Vladimir stopped treating Olaf as a friend. Olaf decided that it was better for him to seek his fortune elsewhere and set out for the Baltic. Raiding. Heimskringla states that after leaving Novgorod, Olaf raided settlements and ports with success. In 982, he was caught in a storm and made port in Wendland, where he met Queen Geira, a daughter of King Berisleif. She ruled the part of Wendland in which Olaf had landed, and Olaf and his men were given an offer to stay for the winter. Olaf accepted, and after courting the queen, they were married. Olaf began to reclaim the baronies which, while under Geira's rule, had refused to pay taxes. After these successful campaigns, he began raiding again both in Skane and Gotland. Relationship and marriage to Geira. Olaf Tryggvason's relationship with Geira began when Geira was warned that were a large number of ships sitting in the harbour. Queen Geira told the man who informed her to invite them to her kingdom, telling him that she would have them over for a feast. Once Olaf and his men arrived, Queen Geira welcomed them in, held a feast for them, and engaged in very meaningful conversation with Olaf. This conversation led to Olaf and his men staying for a few days, and a relationship starting between the two leaders. Eventually these two would agree to a marriage while Olaf and his troops were still there. Later, during one of their conversations, Olaf asked Geira if there were any towns that she had lost control over. She replied, "Lord, I can name for you the towns that have escaped from our control. We have suffered their arrogance for a long time." Following this conversation, Olaf went out and recaptured these towns for Geira. Following this, and their marriage, Olaf would stay in the country until the untimely death of Geira. Alliance with Emperor Otto Roman II. Holy Roman Emperor Otto Roman II assembled a great army of Saxons, Franks, Frisians, and Wends to fight the Norse pagan Danes. Olaf was part of this army because his father-in-law was king of Wendland. Otto's army met the armies of King Harald Bluetooth and Håkon Jarl, the ruler of Norway under the Danish king, at Danevirke, a great wall near Schleswig. Otto's army was unable to break the fortification, so he changed tactics and sailed around it to Jutland with a large fleet. Otto won a large battle there and forced Harald and Håkon with their armies to convert to Christianity. The constituents of Otto's army then returned to their homelands. Harald held to his new religion, but Håkon returned to worshipping the pagan gods when he came home. Death of Geira and conversion. After Olaf had spent 3 years in Wendland, his wife Geira died. He felt so much sorrow from her death that he could no longer bear to stay in Wendland, and set out to plunder in 984. He raided from Friesland to the Hebrides. After 4 years, he landed on one of the Scilly Isles. He heard of a seer who lived there. Desiring to test the seer, he sent one of his men to pose as Olaf. But the seer was not fooled. So Olaf went to see the hermit, now convinced he was a real fortune-teller. And the seer told him, "Thou wilt become a renowned king, and do celebrated deeds. Many men wilt thou bring to faith and baptism, and both to thy own and others' good, and that thou mayst have no doubt of the truth of this answer, listen to these tokens. When thou comest to thy ships, many of thy people will conspire against thee, and then a battle will follow, in which many of thy men will fall, and thou wilt be wounded almost to death, and carried upon a shield to thy ship. Yet after 7 days thou shalt be well of thy wounds, and immediately thou shalt let thyself be baptized. After the meeting mutineers attacked Olaf, and he was wounded but survived, and as a result he converted to Christianity. David Hugh Farmer in the Oxford Dictionary of Saints writes it is tempting to identify the seer with Saint Lyde, who lived on the island of St. Helens in the Isles of Scilly. By another account, Saint Elfie of Canterbury baptized him near Andover, Hampshire, England in 994. However, Henrietta Lacey, the author of Elfie's entry in the Oxford National Dictionary of Biography, states that Olaf was already baptized and that the 994 event at Andover was a confirmation of his faith. Following the death of Geira, it states in the saga of Olaf that he traveled to Russia. During his stay here, he had a dream in which God spoke to him. The voice he heard said, "Hear me, you who promise to be a good man, for you never worshipped gods or paid them any reverence, but rather you disgraced them, and for that reason your works will be multiplied for good and profitable ends. Still you are very deficient in those qualities that would allow you to be in these regions and make you deserving to live here in eternity, because you." Marriage to Gyda. In 988, Olaf sailed to England because a thing had been called by Queen Gyda, sister of Olaf Cuaran, King of Dublin. Gyda was the widow of an earl and was searching for a new husband. A great many men had come, but Gyda singled out Olaf, though he was wearing his bad weather clothes, and the other men wore their finest clothing. They were to be married, but another man, Ulfine, took objection and challenged Olaf and his men to the Scandinavian duel or holmgang. Olaf and his men fought Ulfine's crew and won every battle, but did not kill any of them. Instead, they bound them. Ulfine was told to leave the country and never come back again. Gyda and Olaf married and spent half their time in England and the other half in Ireland. Ascent to the throne. In 995, rumours began to surface in Norway of a king in Ireland of Norwegian blood. This caught the ear of Jarl Håkon, who sent Thoraclaka to Ireland, posing as a merchant, to see if he was the son of Tryggvi Olafsson. Håkon told Thora that if it were him, to lure him to Norway, so Håkon could have him under his power. Thora befriended Olaf and told him of the situation in Norway, that Jarl Håkon had become unpopular with the populace because he often took daughters of the elite as concubines, which was his right as ruler. He quickly grew tired of them and sent them home after a week or two. He had also been weakened by his fighting with the Danish king, due to his rejection of the Christian faith. Olaf seized this opportunity and sailed for Norway. When he arrived, many men had already revolted against Håkon, who was forced to hide in a hole dug in a pigsty, together with his slave Kark. When Olaf met the rebels, they accepted him as their king, and together they started to search for Håkon. They eventually came to the farm where Håkon and Kark were hiding, but did not find them. Olaf held a meeting just outside the swine sty and promised a great reward for the man who killed Håkon. The two men in the hole heard this speech, and Håkon became distrustful of Kark, fearing he would kill him for the reward. He could not leave the pigsty, nor could he stay awake indefinitely, and when he fell asleep Kark decapitated Håkon with a knife. The next day Kark went to Olaf and presented him the head of Håkon. King Olaf did not reward him, and instead decapitated him. After his confirmation as King of Norway, Olaf travelled to the parts of Norway that had not been under the rule of Håkon, but that of the King of Denmark. They also swore allegiance to him. He then demanded that they all be baptized, and most reluctantly they agreed. Reign. In 997, Olaf founded his seat of government in Trondheim, where he had first held a thing with the revolters against Håkon. It was a suitable site because the river Nid twisted itself before going into the fjord, creating a peninsula that could be easily defended against terrestrial attacks by only one short wall. Olaf continued to promote Christianity throughout his reign. He baptized the explorer Leif Erikson, who took a priest with him back to Greenland to convert the rest of his kin. Olaf also converted the people and Earl of the Orkney Islands to Christianity. At that time, the Orkney Islands were part of Norway. It has been suggested that Olaf's ambition was to rule a united Christian Scandinavia, and it is known that he made overtures of marriage to Sigrid the Haughty, Queen of Sweden, but negotiations failed because of her steadfast pagan faith. Instead, he made an enemy of her and did not hesitate to involve himself in a quarrel with King Sweyn I of Denmark by marrying Sweyn's sister Tyra, who had fled from her heathen husband Berislav, the semi-legendary King of Wends, in defiance of her brother's authority. Both his Wendish and his Irish wife had brought Olaf wealth and good fortune, but, according to the sagas, his last wife, Tyra, was his undoing, for it was on an expedition undertaken in 1000 to wrest her lands from Berislav that he was waylaid off the island Esvalder by the combined Swedish, Danish, and Wendish fleets together with the ships of Earl Haakon. The Battle of Esvalder ended in the death of the Norwegian king. Olaf fought to the last on his great vessel Ormenlangi Long Serpent, the mightiest ship in the north, and finally leapt overboard and was seen no more. Legacy. In the early 11th century, a Viking chieftain named Tryggvi invaded Norway, claiming to be the son of Olaf and Gyda. His invasion was defeated by forces loyal to Sinuc the Great's son Svein of Norway. An account preserved in Morkinskinner relates that Tryggvi was killed by a farmer after the battle. Many years later, when Harald Hardrada was king of Norway, he passed by the site of the battle. The king met an old friend of his who pointed out the alleged assassin. After questioning the purported killer and hearing him confess, King Harald had the man hanged, citing the familial bond between him and Tryggvi and his duty to avenge the latter's death. For some time after the Battle of Esvalder, there were rumors that Olaf had survived his leap into the sea and had made his way to safety. Accounts reported by Ottar Snorrason included sightings of Olaf in Rome, Jerusalem, and elsewhere in Europe and the Mediterranean. Both King Ethelred the Unready and Olaf's sister Astrid allegedly received gifts from Olaf long after he was presumed dead. The latest sighting reported by Ottar took place in 1046. Olaf routinely used force to compel conversion to Christianity, including execution and torture of those who refused. Rod the Strong refused to convert and, after a failed attempt using a wooden pin to pry open his mouth to insert a snake, was killed by a snake goaded by a hot poker through a drinking horn into Rod's mouth and down his throat. Eyvind Kinnerfi likewise refused, and was killed by a brazier of hot coals resting on his belly. The possibly apocryphal figure, Sigrid the Haughty, was said